Charlie! Lola? Charlie! Charlie and Lola! It is very special and extremely ancient. Let me see! Please, let me see!
I have this little sister, Lola.
Please, please, please!
She's small and very funny.
Let me see, let me see. Ooh. What is it, Charlie?
Today, I'm going to add something very, very special and amazing to my collection.
Can I see the amazing thing now, Charlie?
OK, Lola, but no touching. It's very precious.
Ooh. That's a stone, Charlie. A brown stone.
It's very, very amazing and special.
Is it a very special stone from the garden?
No, Lola. This stone is ancient. It's really, really, really old.
Did it come from Granny's garden? Granny's very, very old. She's older than even 25.
It's much, much older than Granny and Grandpa. It's not just a stone. This is an actual fossil.
Ooh.
It's like a skeleton of an animal that lived a very long time ago, at the same time as the dinosaurs.
It looks all whirly, like a curly slide. So how did the fossil get into the stone?
Fossil, Lola. Well, it's quite hard to explain. This is an ammonite fossil, and it lived under the sea. As the dinosaur age came to an end, the little ammonite was slowly covered with lots of seaweed, and dirt, and rock, and ice. And it very quietly turned into stone.
But Charlie, how did you get it if it was all buried and inside rocks?
Because the earth is moving all the time, and rocks are being worn away. So at last, my fossil came to the surface again.
But how did you know there was a fossil inside this stone?
I didn't. Dad gave it to me. You can find them yourself, but you've got to look really hard, though. There are amazing fossils still undiscovered all over the world. Whole dinosaur fossils, even. I'm Spinosaurus fossil! Ha ha ha!
Charlie, do you think it would be all right if I took your special fossil into my class and told them all the fossil story?
OK, but only if I can carry it into school and I carry it back home again.
Yes, Charlie, you can do all of the carrying. That's really interesting. Don't touch. You must not do touching.
It is very, very precious.
And special. And very, very old. Older than 100 and a million years, maybe.
Lola, do you think we can start a fossil collection together, you and me?
Yes, Lotta. I think that is an extremely and good idea.
So do I.
But we have to look really, really hard. I don't think there's a fossil in a sandwich. Lotta! I think I can see one.
Ooh, it's a button.
Oh. Ooh. Let's go over.
Have you lost something?
No, Charlie. We're hunting for fossils.
We are hunting for fossils, but you'll never find one in the playground. You have to go somewhere where you can dig for them.
Dig?
Dig? Uh-huh.
I know. Let's go to the park. Dad can take us. Yes!
There won't be any fossils by the swings, will there, Charlie? No.
Look, Lotta! Sizzles is digging for fossils. Go on, Sizzles. He's got one! He's got a fossil! Come on, Sizzles. Give it to me. Sizzles, come back. Sizzles! Sizzles, come back! Give it to me, Sizzles.
Have it, Sizzles.
And it's bouncy. Oh, it's a bouncy ball. We need to do the digging, Lotta, not Sizzles. 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, 6, 5, 10. A fossil! A fossil of a fish. Yes, a very old swimmy fish.
It's a nice lolly stick, Lola.
Oh.
I'm sure you have to dig where there are rocks if you want to find a fossil.
I know, the rockery. That has lots of rocks in it. Yes, yes, yes. I've got one. Charlie, look, a baby turtle fossil.
I think it might be a walnut shell, Lola.
Do you think we will ever find a fossil, Lotta? I'm not very sure.
Hey, listen, Lola. Mum and Dad are going to take us all out tomorrow. Somewhere we might really, really find a fossil.
7 old fossils lying on the beach, and if one old fossil was very near my reach. My dad said lots of fossils live in the place where we're going. 6 old fossils lying on the beach.
Fossils are right inside the rocks, so real fossil hunters tap the rocks to see if there's one inside. Here, these are good for tapping.
Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tappity tap. Tap, tap. Lola, I think this pointy stone is definitely the fossil claw of a tigery dinosaur. Look, Lotta, this twisty rock is the curly-whirly horn of a dinosaur with a very, very curly horn, called the very curly hornosaurus. And this is a long, swishy wig for a dressing-up dinosaur.
Come on, Lola. Mum and Dad say it's home time.
Look at all our fossils, Charlie.
I don't think they are fossils, Lola.
Are you sure?
I think they're just stones. Come on, Dad's waiting. I know you didn't find a fossil, but it was fun searching for one, wasn't it?
I suppose so. Look, Charlie, a fossil!
Well, I'm not sure.
It is, Charlie, it is.
Well...
Yes, because look, it has wiggly legs. Yes, look. Lots of wiggly legs, Charlie.
Maybe.
It's definitely a wiggly leg fossil, isn't it?
Well, it looks a bit like a centipede, but
Yes, it's a centipede. We found a centipede fossil.
I only said it looks very like a fossil, Lola.
It is a fossil. Look at all its wobbly legs. Mrs. Hanson will probably say it is the best fossil she has ever seen, ever. Hurry up, Lola.
Mrs. Hanson might say it isn't. Ugh.
Run faster.
I don't think it was a fossil, Charlie. Did you show the fossil to Mrs. Hanson and everybody? So, what did she say? Did she say it wasn't a fossil?
Mrs. Hanson said that it was very likely to be a fossil. In fact, the hardest to find kind of fossil. It was called a nematode, which is not a centipede, but a sort of worm. A worm? A very, very old worm.
A nematode, Charlie.
Wormy.
Lola, do you think I can borrow the nematode to put in my fossil collection?
Charlie, we would like to do borrowing, But Mrs. Hanson has kept it, you see, to show to a museum person.
A museum person? Wow!
Look, Lotta, it's our nematode.
Ooh.
Yes, the museum lady said it was very special and very rare.